thereabouts forward, okay? But what you don't understand is how GPS became interwoven into the fabric of our life. You know, I started my job building a satellite, and that's what I wanted to do. And in the end, what I was watched it happen as I evolved over those 30 years is that GPS became something that if it ever went down was going to cause a whole lot of hurt to a whole bunch of people in this world. And that weighed on me very much every day when I went into it. So in the prehistory, you have to understand is we're going to explain how the Slovakian independence movement in 1918, the development of radar, Nixon being elected to a second term in the White House, the launch of the Sputnik satellite, and the AC-130 gunship program. If any of those things didn't happen, we wouldn't have GPS today. And then during this talk, I will also highlight to you that if anybody's been in the GPS, you know that we love our ICDs, and also that we carry a secondary payload called the NDS, Nuclear Detection System. Yes, we do detect nuclear bombs, explosions in the atmosphere and above on a GPS satellite. And everybody forgets about that, and from time to time they try to throw that payload off, but it's really woven into our fabric. And finally, occasionally I get questions about, we've heard that Raytheon really invented GPS. Well, I'm going to go and tell you the story about that story and let you make a decision. And then finally, the other thing that at the end of the day, you're going to be impressed by the cast of characters that came together at the right time, at the right space, time and space to get GPS to where it is today. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we're going to start off on a little trip in the prehistory of GPS going all the way back to 1912. The gentleman you see before you is Dr. Ivan Getting. His parents ran a Slovakian newspaper, and one of their big things was to get a free Slovakia. And so they would have, every night they would invite political figures, luminaries, whoever could help them into their home, for which ended up into all night long strategy sessions on how they were going to make this happen. Okay? You got to understand is that Dr. Getting's bedroom was right above the living room, and that's where everybody meets. So if you talk to Ivan, he would tell you every night he'd be hearing glasses clinking, talk, yelling, screaming, disagreements, and everything. Every night he was going to sleep. This is what happened in his house. The good news is when World War I ended, Czechoslovakia was granted independence. Not exactly what the family wanted, but the father understood that he was called, you know, the importance, and so he packed up the family, headed on over to Europe, and assumed a minor role in the government. And he did that for quite a few years. And it isn't the independence didn't last long. The job just didn't exactly work out for Ivan's father. So he decided to return everybody back to the United States. So he missed out a lot of early education in the American school system and was trained in the European ways, good or bad, I don't know. But one thing that he showed on from an early age is that he had technical prowess. And he was actually selected by the state of New Jersey to be their contestant in the next Edison. There was a huge debate going on in the late 20s about who would go and pick up the technological torch. And they wanted to find the next Edison to lead them on. So every state was required to supply a candidate. New Jersey selected Ivan. As I said, the good news for us is that he lost. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's roll forward into about 1930. Let's see, it was 12. 1930. In 1930, he was given a scholarship, full ride to MIT. And interesting story is that when he got to MIT and after about the first semester, he found out that the scholarship ended. and he was no longer allowed to stay in the dorms, so he had to hustle to find a place to live. And where he found a place to live was in a basement of a boarding house that had a dirt floor, which he slept on, and his job was to stoke the coal furnace all night long to keep everybody warm. He took this time while he was stoking the furnace to go and read his textbooks, which was done by the fire of the coal furnace, okay? He did a really good job at academics. He knocked it out of the park, okay? Ended up getting a full ride to Cambridge. And over in Cambridge, he happened to end up at the time, you know, this is the 30s. This is when nuclear science was just happening. Guys like Compton and the others were there at Cambridge. And they went off and they started working on the English radar team. But about that time, they could see the winds of war coming in Europe, and he thought it would be best if he would return to the States and that. So what did he do? Called up MIT, says, hey, I'd like to come home. Got anything for me? He says, yeah, Yvonne, come on back. We got this thing called the radiation lab that we're starting up. Okay, great. He shows up in the United States, goes back, finds out, walks in the first day of the radiation lab. Who does he meet? Lee DeBridge. Remember that name. That's a very important name as we go forward, okay? What was the radiation lab, you may ask? Well, the radiation lab was the American radar team. So we're talking about Yvonne sitting right on the cutting edge of one of the most important inventions for World War II, all right? The development radar was the thing that really helped turn the tide. I'd like to remind everybody, just remember that, an invention that turned the tide of war. Wow, that's pretty heady. Okay. Let's go on to the next slide now. Okay, up until now, nothing was happening in the world of GPS, nothing. Everything was just, people were beginning to form up. The very first step towards GPS is in 1957. The Navy had decided they needed to build the Fleet Ballistic Missile Program, which is the sea leg of the triad, to launch nuclear missiles at an adversary. Okay, great, no problem. And says, what were the requirements for this system? They said, well, the only thing that you got to know is you got to know exactly where you launched from to be able to hit your target at the end. And oh, by the way, it has to work into a saltwater environment, okay? Well, the Navy guys looked at that requirement and said, not a problem. We have this thing called Nautilus, just went up under the ice pack, ran around, came back home. Not a problem, guys. We've got this inertial measurement unit. And what we do is that we stick a telescope up out of the water. We go find some stars. We make the position of the stars. And then we go and record that into the INS, and then we go below. Some admiral's sitting there going like, how many minutes are you up on the surface of the water? Oh, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you know, don't worry. The periscope doesn't go that far above the water. And the guy was sitting there going like, no, that ain't going to work. They needed another solution. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, who provided the answer? Believe it or not, it is our former adversary and now, quote, friend. Russia or the Soviet Union did it. In October of 57, they launched, October 4th to be exact, they launched the first artificial satellite into space. Wow, everybody in their kid brother was running around trying to do this. In the newspaper article, they had printed at what frequency the satellite was broadcasting on. Okay, everybody was listening. The hangar was set up all over across the United States. If you come over here at JPL, they had a ham shack that was suddenly taken over for national security needs because they had the ability to listen to the Sputnik satellite. But over on the East Coast, the Applied Physics Laboratory, there was two gentlemen, Dr. Geyer and Dr. Wiffenbach, okay, who went up on top of the building, made an antenna, formed an antenna to listen to the Sputnik specifically, hooked it up to a receiver, and started displaying it onto like, I wonder what it looks like on an oscilloscope. Oh, I wonder, you got a time base? Let's go and grab one of these. So the story that is told is that on top of the Applied Physics building there at Johns Hopkins, all these scientists and engineers were hauling all sorts of equipment up. This is October, for God's sakes. It gets cold, it rains. This was very expensive hardware, and they're running up and down these stairs making these measurements. And what was Geyer and Wiffenbach said is that they could not believe how predictable and how dramatic was the Doppler frequency shift of the signals. Okay? So anyway, their boss was Dr. Frank T. McClure. He goes looking around the lab one day, finds out nobody's there, and he's going, where is everybody? And so he ends up going up the stairwell to the roof, and he's sitting there, and there's all these guys jumping around, and they're going like, here it comes, 3, 2, 1, bam, here comes the signal. They could predict very accurately when the signal will appear. They then started predicting the Doppler shift. They started working out all the math, and he was sitting there looking at it and going like, you know, I think I just got a solution to the accurate solution fix. So Dr. McClure went down the ladder, went over to the APL Polaris Support Division, okay, and said, hey, Dr. Kirshner, guess what? We can do it with radio waves, and it'll only take you a second or two with the telescope above, or the periscope above the water, okay? And you got to understand is Dr. Kirshner was a real machine. If you ever, you know, he's a program manager, technical visionary, like you never could believe in that. So he saw that and immediately went around, got a team together, and wrote an unsolicited proposal to the Navy. And inside of it, he said, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to develop the satellites, we're going to develop the receivers, we're going to develop the control segment that's needed for it, okay? And we're going to be able to pull this off in short order, okay? And let's see. You know, it will have enough accuracy that'll satisfy your launch. Great, no problem. They sent it into the Navy. Now, my experience with unsolicited proposals is that they don't go very far. But lo and behold, next slide. Something called NNSS was born. That was the original name, and those are the first 5 satellites that you see. Well, that's Dr. Kirshner himself in the middle, holding on to his 2 satellites. So he put this team together, and what they did is that they delivered the first test satellite in 7 months. The first launch was 2 months later. Operational of the transit system occurred 5 years later. Anybody who's been in aerospace can say 5 years is really pushing it forward, okay? And the good news is that the accuracy of the system, that when they launched and tested it, it was running at about 15 to 25 meters if they had zero velocity component. They're used to errors in the range of nautical miles, not meters. So man, when the Navy saw this, they just went, holy cats. A little spoiler that I'll tell you now is that 15 to 25 meters was reduced to a lot smaller, to a 1 meter error about 15, 20 years later. Well, that's another story we can go on to. Okay, so next slide, please. All right, now, that's the Navy, big Navy. That's what they're doing, all right? Army, they got a different problem. Army had to go and figure out the geodetic coordinates of a ground point that was located somewhere 160 to 4,800 kilometers from a known geodetic reference. Who were these guys in the Army? It was the Defense Mapping System. Ballistic missile technology was going along. Corona was taking pictures, sending them down to the ground, and they had to start locating all those images, all those points on those photographs had to be located, and located down to as accurate as they can get it to. So the SECOR system was created, sequential correlation of range. It consisted of 4 satellites and a ground station, all right? Theory of operation was that you would run out, you would transmit a 4021 megahertz signal up, and you would listen to the return down to 224 megahertz and 449, and then you would determine your accuracy, which ended up being about 30 meters. Okay, all right. But they had a goal of 10 meters, and it wasn't cutting the mustard yet. All right. The guys who built this was down in San Diego. They were formerly known as Cubic. They are now part of the L3 division. And if you go in their lobby, or you used to go into the lobby, you would see a Block 2 SECOR satellite sitting on display. Next chart, please. Okay. So let's review. Navy's sitting there going off and using radio navigation means to determine location. Army's close behind developing their system, independent of the Navy, all right? And the Air Force now gets involved, and they decide that the land-based segment of the triad was vulnerable. They were really worried about placing missiles inside of fixed silos. And so they came up with something called the Mobile Railroad Minuteman Program. All right? Their whole idea was that they were going to go and put Minuteman missiles in railroad cars and drive them around, and when they got the launch call order, they'd stop, raise the missile up, launch it, and then get out of there. All right? Great. They knew that this was coming. Raytheon knew it was coming, so they went off and started an internal think tank of how are they going to do this job. They really wanted to get inside of the emerging guided missile market. So they went off and developed something called MOSAIC. All right. MOSAIC was conceived and it was included in the proposal to the Air Force. All right. But prior to the proposal submittal, Raytheon presented this concept to a bunch of Air Force officials on the 11th of May of 1960. Inside of the meeting was Shep Arkin, Dr. Getting, gave the presentation, all right? And in that meeting too should have his name right here, and I don't see it. Okay, don't see, yeah, I know, I see Shep's name, but I thought it was coming. Okay, so in there they revealed MOSAIC. Okay, what was exactly MOSAIC's concept? Well, the missile would contain a receiver that would make time difference of arrivals from 4 land-based transmitters to determine its location in 3 dimensions. That means that the missile never actually had to know exactly where it is, but it could derive its location just before launch. Going back to the Navy problem, if you accurately know where your launch point is, you can hit your target. Very, very good. This is why Raytheon claims, hey, we invented GPS. Not exactly, because GPS does more than positioning, it does timing too. So we're going to go and declare an audible and give them a half a point for trying on it, okay? Oh yeah, and MOSAIC was Mobile System for Accurate ICBM Control. Next chart, please. Okay, now we're getting up to where we're going to start serious development for GPS, okay? But we got to tell you is that the Mobile Railroad Program didn't go anywhere. When arms control people started looking at it, they said that would be such a destabilizing influence in the mutually assured destruction doctrine that they had to kill it. Bam. Okay. Now, I'll point out is that 11th of May meeting of 1960, where Yvonne was sitting there briefing all those important people. One of the guys in the back room was Joe Czopek. He was Undersecretary of the Air Force at the time. Okay. Up until that point, Yvonne had had an illustrious career. He made it up the vice president of Raytheon, cutting edge technology. I mean, he was A-game right now, all right? And what did Dr. Czopek did? He says, hey, Yvonne, I'm creating this thing called Aerospace Corporation. Its sole purpose is to support intercontinental ballistic missile development, and I want you to run it, all right? That act of offering him the job is what started GPS heading down the track. All right, next slide, please. Okay, before we get into the main story, we got to talk about another Navy program. You see, APL and the Polaris guys were out having fun with their little satellites. But over at the NRL, Naval Research Laboratories, Dr. Easton had a vision to explore the idea of providing both accurate position and precise time to a passive terrestrial observer. Okay, he's the first guy that brought in the time part into the solution. Okay, the concept was explored and was based on atomic clock technology, and timation was going to employ side tone ranging techniques. Okay, not pseudo-random codes, not code divisional multiplexing. It was side tone ranging. Okay, and against Navy brass is that he went off and he started advocating it, saying like, hey, that transit problem, we can do better. I can give you a lot better services on that. Pick me, pick my timation. I don't know how that went over inside of the Navy, but it was definitely heard up in the Pentagon. Next slide, please. We're going to go back. All right, let's talk about tone ranging. It was not a modulation technique, like I told you, but a set of continuous wave subcarriers by tone frequencies. And let's see, first experiment was in 1967. It showed that the STR was a viable. RCA, the builder of transit, did a study and showed that STR combination with the proven Doppler method would provide near instantaneous position with a single satellite. Interesting. Okay, the RCA study assumed that 4 satellites distributed in a medium altitude orbit with clocks synchronized to a master clock. The altitude to be chosen, the altitude that was going to be chosen was dependent on the accuracy of the clock flown. That's not exactly, that's what the official book says. Is really what they understood at that time is that they had a relativistic offset that they needed to compensate. And so if you put it up at about 9,000 kilometers, the offset was 0. If you did anything else, you need to, quote, change the frequency of the output of the clock. That's a whole different story. And that's what they tried to do when the NTS2 program, they tried to go and build that offset to demonstrate that they could change the frequency. Thank you. Next chart. Okay, so back at the Aerospace Corporation, just think about it. Dr. Yvonne Getting has lived in the New England area for all his life, essentially. New Jersey, Boston area. Hey, you know, loved it. All right. He gets a call from the Undersecretary of the Air Force. Go west, young man. Form the Aerospace Corporation. All right. I can only imagine when Yvonne went home to talk to his wife that night and told the kids is that, hey, pack it up. We're moving to California. No questions asked, all right? And people, I will point out to you, is why did Yvonne just suddenly jump at this opportunity? He says, I claim it was his DNA. I claim it was his father's and family's influence. When his father heard that Czechoslovakia was going to be given its freedom, he wanted to be part of it. And he felt it was his duty to go and do whatever he needed to do to make it successful. And so Yvonne just was following what was bred into him, all right? So he gets over to Aerospace, gets the place up and running, and after a couple of years, they got to start figuring out what they're going to do, because this Minuteman, Atlas, Titan, Minuteman program is, you know, beginning to wind down. They can see the end of the tunnel, and they didn't want Aerospace to fold up and disappear. So he created 2 projects. Project 75, which is, let's see, what was the acquired in 1975, which they considered to be 25 years after the founding of Aerospace, and Project 57, to see what other military potential could be achieved by new technology, especially space technology. Okay, well, another name that if you go into the annals of GPS history is Dr. Diamond. He's the one who carried out the Project 57 effort. And in that process, he determined the need for a tactical aircraft with an accuracy of 50 feet. And he figured out that a space-based system could do that job very well. So remember, guys, let's see, 50 feet is somewhere in around the, what do you want to call it, the 10 to 15 meter range. Yeah, it's kind of consistent with what SECOR and what Transit was doing. So, okay. Oh, no, excuse me, it wasn't there. He needed something that was far better than that. So it was down to 2 orders better than the transit system. And in October of 1963, the Air Force requested Aerospace to continue studying this. And in 66, they had completed all the internal preliminary work and sat there, and they put out 2 contracts were awarded, one to TRW and the other to Hughes to develop the space-based system, which they now called 621B. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, what is 621B? Well, they had this idea. You remember satellites cost a lot of money back then. All right, so you don't want to put too many of them up there. And so they decided they needed something where about 12 to 16 satellites. And they would fly them at GEO, okay? And there would be clusters of 4 satellites at a time. One satellite would stay at geosynchronous at the equator, and then the other 3 would do either the egg beater or the X constellation, whatever they called it, but they would be put at slightly inclined orbits so they looked like they were rotating around the central one. All right. So the nice thing about 621B, wide area and global coverage, check. Continuous availability, check. 3D accuracies and velocity fixes, check. Okay. Usable and rapid maneuvering vehicles, check, check. Very nice. And no radiation from users, like the SECOR system where they had to transmit up and listen to the return down. Now, they didn't have to give away their position. I mean, it was right in line with transit. It was same thing with STTR and the Navy's timation program. Check. Okay. Next slide, please. We had a problem. Navy's got an up and running navigation system called Transit. Army's got an up and running geolocation service called SECOR. Small part of the Navy is complaining that the other part of the Navy isn't listening to them, and they've got a better idea, and it's called timation. And then now the Air Force comes walking into the SecDef office and says, hey, Mr. Secretary, Air Force wants to build a navigation system called 621B, okay? And they sat there and looked at them and they said, no way, Jack. It says, what we're going to do is we're going to form a navigation satellite executive group, okay, NAVSEG. All 3 branches would be represented, okay? They wanted to advocate for an enhanced form of transit. They always went into the meeting saying, hey, don't worry, our transit system can be expanded. Don't worry, okay? But the problem was that there was no unified position when it was ever derived, but they did agree to work on a space demonstration of a proposed 3D nav system, all right? And that resulted in the flight of the Timation 2 satellite in 1969, and then later, which turned into the Navigation Test Satellite series. All right, so that's why I'm sitting there going, classic government response. When you can't make a decision, you form a committee. The committee gets into the room and decides, hey, we're going to turn this into a big formal process and blah, blah, blah. And that's where they went off. And that's where it was sitting. So everybody was sitting there going like, oh, wait a minute, I thought you were going to pick me and we were going to go and start building it. No, I'm sorry. It was time to go and do a shoot off. All right, next slide, please. Okay, this is 1969. Government is struggling with the Vietnam War. NASA is going to land a man on the moon, and they got a whole problem there. What are they going to do with NASA afterwards? All right, so once again, what does the government do? They form a committee. The Space Task Group was formed to suggest post-Apollo path for NASA. Okay, well, Dr. Getting, since he was president of the Aerospace Corporation, was invited to sit on top of this committee, all right? And at any time he told everybody that they really needed 3D space-based navigation for both civilian and users and military users, okay? And he put this forward. He tied a bow around it, put a ribbon around it, gave it to Vice President Agnew at the time. And he says, please choose my solution, the space-based navigation solution for what NASA should do. They didn't do it. They went off there and they decided to go build the shuttle. Okay? And that's Dr. Gettings is sitting there going like, oh, wait a minute. And he says, no, that's not right. So what does he do? He immediately runs to the White House, and guess who he finds sitting there as the scientific advisor to Richard Nixon? His old buddy Lee DeBridge. Oh man, he's sitting there. Hey, Collego, come on, let's talk. And he says, so in there, we listened to Ivan very carefully, nodded his head, and essentially said to him, he says, yeah, I can see all your points, Ivan, but if you can find, looks like you might have a need, but if you can find somebody who's willing to pay the bill, I'd be more than happy to throw my weight behind it. Some would take this response as a polite way to decline the offer. But remember, Ivan, in his marching to the orders with a higher vision, is that he sat there and says, oh man, I just had the science advisor give me a blank check to go around and advocate this anytime I want to. Bam, he's off and running. Okay, next chart, please. Okay, not only was he working on the Space Task Group board, okay, but he also sat on the Scientific Advisory Board for the DoD. Okay, now the SAB charter is supposed to provide independent wisdom and insight to the Air Force senior leadership on science and technology for continued air and space dominance. All right, and so sitting on this board were a whole bunch of people that were very important. Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for R&D, Deputy of Chief of Staff for R&D, Commander of the System Commands, and many, many other officers in this world and the others in that. And what Dr. Getting says in his book is that anytime he attended one of those meetings, he actually, it's not GPS he was pushing for a 621B, but he brought it up as the solution to about everything. So if you sat through one of these meetings or attended multiple of these meetings, you were slowly being brainwashed that 621B, 3D navigation, instantaneous location was what you needed. You heard it over and over and over again, okay? That's going to come back to bite us in a little bit, but let's continue. Okay, now you're getting to my hero, all right? I used to, quote, fear this man, and now I am in total awe of this man. Dr. Brad Parkinson, there at the time, he's Colonel Parkinson, grew up in Minnesota, was an only child. Good news is his father attended MIT. Okay. Went to a private academy high school and did quite well there. Got an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy. All right, not a problem. Check that box there. A lot of people says, he went to the Naval Academy. Why didn't he go Air Force? Well, you got to remember, this is back in, let's see, I think he graduated in 57, so it was 54 when he showed up at the Naval Academy. There was no Air Force Academy yet. It was still being created. Okay, but what they did is that they gave you an option out of all the schools, and they still do today, is that you can put on any uniform you want after you graduate. You just have to let us know. So Brad's sitting there going like, oh man, am I going to be a sub driver? Nah, I don't like submarines. Do I want to be a surface warfare? Nah, I don't like that, or stuff like that. And there was a guy at the academy who sat there and says, hey, Brad, this is, what do you want? And he says, well, I want to get a PhD. And he says, listen, Navy isn't going to support that. Go Air Force. Air Force is going to support you getting a PhD. He says, Brad says, that's what I'm going to do. Says, what does he do? He signs up, goes into the Air Force, ends up down in New Mexico at White Sands testing inertial guidance units for a while. And he puts in an application to MIT. What did he study at MIT? Well, he studied engineering, of course, electrical engineering, inertial guidance, astronautics, you know, all the subjects that you would expect that a good master thesis goes. Comes out of there, runs around, gets another little 1 or 2 jobs, and immediately grabs a PhD, a title, or not title. He goes to get his PhD at Stanford. So in a very, you know, he graduated in 57, and by 66, 9 years later, he's sitting there with a brand new spanking PhD sitting on his wall. And he's left a trail of people behind, knowing everybody and everything. So what do you do with a PhD from Stanford in the Air Force in about 1966? They look at that and they said, not really command material. I know, we'll send him to the Air Force Academy. So the Air Force Academy was brand new. So Brad sits there, packs the family up. He was married by then, had a couple of kids, moves them up to Colorado Springs, goes into his office, is sitting in his office, working down his class schedule for the semester. Okay, and okay, and he's doing really good. Next slide, please.
Frank, if I can chime in a little, if I could, on that, while it's relevant. Interesting thing about the founding of the U.S. Air Force before there was an Air Force Academy was that in order to ensure that the U.S. Air Force was a separate service in its own right, not just a continuation of the U.S. Army Air Forces with West Point tradition, they mandated that 25% of the new officer corps would come from West Point, from the U.S. Military Academy West Point. The other 25% would come from the U.S. Naval Academy. And there's actually another presentation which I can send you guys a link to. In fact, when they standed up the first class of the Air Force Academy, the initial class, they didn't have upperclassmen. So they took people from West Point and the Naval Academy to be the air training officers that surrogate upperclassmen. And Contrails is actually created by Navy guys, so that probably plays a part as to why he, as a Naval Academy guy, ended up joining the Air Force and doing this in the Air Force as opposed to the Navy.
Wonderful theory, but from the horse's mouth, it was an instructor at the Air Force, at the Naval Academy. He told him, no, you want a PhD? Go Air Force. So
that as well.
Yeah. I'm just telling you, this is Brad. I always get this question: how come he didn't stay in the Navy? He says no. He wanted a PhD. He wanted. Excuse me, and I didn't stress this. What did his dad have? Dad had a PhD from MIT. Brad wanted the same thing. He was impressed with his father. Okay, so he wanted to go there, and if he was going to get a PhD, he was going to get it from MIT, but somehow he ended at Stanford. And I still don't understand the story, and that's another, when the coronavirus dies down, then I'll be able to sit and get that part of the story from Brad. Okay, but thank you for that little history, and I would like to see your briefing. If you could send me that link, that would be great. Okay?
Will do.
Okay, so now it's getting really interesting. He's sitting in there, and Brad is in his office setting it up, as I said, and he hears somebody pounding on his wall. Hey, Brad, come on over here. And so Brad walks next door, and there he's got this guy who's sitting in his office, and he teaches control theory at the academy. And there's two guys from Eglin Air Force Base. They're sitting with him, and they says, "We got a problem. We're just trying to build our first AC-130 ship. Okay, this is not the old Cargo Master version. This is the big guy. Okay, and they wanted to put a 105 millimeter cannon on it. Okay, and they want to fly it around. And we've been doing some testing, and guess what? This thing just doesn't shoot straight." And so Brad's sitting there listening to the story, and he's talking to the controls guy, and he's going back into his past and his control theory, and he's doing this, and he makes some, quote, suggestions. They wrote down the suggestions. They left. Next thing you know what, Brad's getting a call from the commandant of the Air Force Academy. Major Parkinson. He says, "Good to hear you're making an impression on our staff." He says, "Here's your orders to go to Eglin Air Force Base down in Florida." And Brad's just sitting there going like, semester's coming up. I was just getting ready to teach. No. You got to go work on this gunship problem, okay? All right. So Brad goes down there, and they start working on the gunship. And boy, did they have problems on side of there, okay? I'm going to get there in a minute, okay, because we got to tell a little story before gunship and that. So when he gets down there, he finds out one of the reasons why the thing isn't shooting straight is that you needed to go and anchor the gun into the frame of the airplane. And what they did is that they just literally piled it on sandbags and had baling wire holding it into the place. And Brad says, this thing isn't going to shoot straight for anything. Then he started looking at how the control system was logged into the gun, and that was all screwed up. And Brad was just sitting there once again making a list. Here's all the things that you got to go and change and stuff like that. They said, "Great, thank you." So I would make some of these changes and check them out. And he says, "Do I have to?" And he calls back to the academy, and they said, "Yeah, you got to stay down there, get that stuff done." He said, "Okay, no problem. I can spend a couple months doing this." And that's how he goes down there, and he's getting really into the gunship. And guess what? all the problems begin to evaporate, all right? And all the times that he's working on it, he's being told is that they've got to get this gunship over to Vietnam. And you ask yourself, why did they want the gunship over there? Now, let's go back and look at the Air Force at that time. The Air Force, like the gentleman said, came from the Army Air Corps. And what did the Army Air Corps do? Bombers. Bombers, bombers, bombers all the time. In the early 60s, tactical fighters were now the thing. And so there was this big yin and yang about, hey, you know, we should have bombers. No, we should have tactical aircraft. No, we should have missiles. And there was all this internal debate inside the Air Force about what their exact mission is. These guys down in Eglin were sitting there going like, guys, we got to help the warfighter. Okay, we got to build this thing that's able to take out enemies. And one of the things they targeted was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You got to understand is that anytime you fight a prolonged battle, you need supplies to keep your troops motivated and moving forward. Once you cut the supply line, they're toast. Okay, and every day, thousands of trucks would be running down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, going off to various different spots. And there's a few people in the United States government who recognized it and they wanted to do something about it, hence get that gunship out to the Vietnam, okay? And so the next thing you know, Brad thinks he's heading back to Colorado Springs. He's inside of the C-130 as they're doing a ferry flight all the way over to Nam, ends up in Thailand at the U Thon Air Base. And so what they're doing now is that they're taking the airplane, going up, flying it around, seeing how it behaves, and coming back, telling the people what the problems is, and they're off going to fix it, okay? Now, that was Gunship 2, all right? And during this time, the major feature on Gunship 2 is if you look on my the top figure, you'll see a little red bubble in the back, and that's where they put on a big searchlight. Why did they need the searchlight? Well, then the gunship showed up into the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They could hear the airplane coming, and they would see it, and they would immediately start to get mowed out. The trucks were being just destroyed. So they started, you know, stopping the flow. But as soon as nightfall came, they knew that this airplane couldn't go and hunt them at night. So they sat there and they said, hey, we'll just drive at night. Not a problem. They went back there and they stuck that big searchlight on the back of the tailgate of the AC-130. And they were flying around illuminating the trail, seeing the trucks, and they started blowing them to smithereens. Job well done, okay? That was really going good. And then the Viet Cong got onto that one, and they said, well, when we hear the aircraft coming, what we're going to do is we're going to pull it into the jungle, and we're going to keep the engines running. We're going to wait until he flies away from me, and then we're going to start driving again. Well, it's really getting difficult to find out who made the suggestion, but somebody on that team at U Thon Air Base mentioned, you know, guys, if we put an electro-optics pod, we could detect heat signatures. And, oh, by the way, if you look in that red square, that red circle on the lower one, if you go get me an electronic warfare receiver, I will be able to tune into the spark gap emissions of the Ford pickup truck. Viet Cong loved the Ford pickups, the Ford trucks. So, you know, they had it dialed in exactly the frequency. And then somebody inside of that team decided, you know, if I know where that EW receiver could give you range and bearing information, I could take that information and I can put it back into the gun system. So now we can start slaving the guns to the EW receiver, add in the infrared pod, and now you're talking surprise package. And this thing was unstoppable. Hey, guys, read the research about what it was doing. They were going out every night and blowing everything out of the water, okay? And this is it. That's why you take a look up until Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese had full run of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Right after Tet Offensive, they realized the mistake because they just saw the trucks running down there and they never really put it together that they were supplying for a major invasion. And all of a sudden, the war machine started to stop. North Vietnamese, okay? Some people claim it was Nixon requesting the B-52s to do the bombing, but some people on the other side of the fence say, you know what, when they saw that they could no longer supply their troops, that's when they raised their hand and said, Uncle, hey, let's go do some peace talks, okay? Well, the next slide, please. Okay. Okay, so there's a couple interesting things that you're going to see in here. First of all, I have to read this, is they went over the gunship carefully and discovered and resolved the problems. Okay, and officers from the Air Force Academy, Brad Parkinson and Major Wills, were the ones who helped. That went out in an official report. Brad was getting visibility like you would not believe in that. And also during that time, Brad saw what Lorraine navigation proof to increasing the reliability and accuracy. Somebody else went off and got a Lorraine receiver and started putting it inside of the gunship. You remember the Navy problem of trying to know when you fire something, is it going to hit the target? And it only gets better if you know the location. They were using Lorraine navigation system to provide inputs into the flight, into their INS system to, quote, reduce their residual error. So they knew exactly where in the sky they were, and they knew what their pointing system was. So that's why leaps and bounds, okay? And then if we go down there, for precision required, especially when it came to compensation for the aircraft in the second paragraph, Air Force Academy Laboratory later reworked and improved the platform. And towards the end of the Commando Hunt 3, the new television platform sustained smoother and more accurate and responsive tracking than before. All right, so what you're seeing is that this whole slide is that everything on the gunship that was getting better was due to Brad's hand. Okay, Brad was getting recognized in reports, in the activity, you know, everywhere. And that the interesting thing is that as they built the surprise package, with the increase of more sophisticated, bottom paragraph on the right-hand side, with the increased and more sophisticated equipment, the pilot became overburdened with firing data and while flying the aircraft. So what they did is they created a new position called Mission Commander. And later, the fire control officer became part of the surprise package crew when the gunship began its combat operations services. Okay, what does that mean? That means is that for 26 missions in the air, Brad was listed as officially the fire control officer. And he flew on the aircraft, and he ran day-to-day ops on it. And if you look at it, is that for 2 of those missions, is that he was promoted or given the title of Mission Commander. He had total authority on the aircraft, all right? Hey guys, anybody who's been in the military has got to understand, this is a guy who was billeted to the Air Force Academy, and now he's into a shooter type of position, all right? Unheard of, unbelievable, okay? PhD sitting there out of the academy, and he's sitting there commanding aircraft in field, doing everything. You know, my God. You know, if you were to guess what was going to happen to Brad Parkinson at this time in his life, you thought this guy's going somewhere. Next slide, please. Well, as I mentioned before, is that no, let me mention it now. Is that as good engineers, we are always taught a technical solution will be the best solution for your problem. Now that I am an older engineer, I realize is that there are 3 solutions to any problem. 1 is the technical. That's the easy one to do. 2 is the financial. How cheap can you do it? Can we afford that solution? And 3, the most gnarly one of them all, is political solution. How can your idea rise above the internal politics and become something successful, okay? And so what was happening is that unbeknownst, see, Brad was tooled in the first one. He understood the technical solution, and that last slide is the one that drove it home. He knew how to make the thing work. Not a problem, all right? What he did not understand is that there was a huge Air Force fight going on there, asking about what is the surprise package? You know, how is it doing? Okay, do we need to buy any more of these things? Can we get by with just a few? Because, like I said, technical Air Force guys are sitting there looking at that, going like, "Hey, they want to buy another airplane. It's going to come out of our fighters." Okay, bombers were already gone. Missile guys are sitting there saying, well, we're all done and that. So, you know, in the great battle of the Air Force budgets is that TAC had an opposition to the continued production of the AC-130 program, okay? And so this was going on back and forth. And in the end, the Air Force Secretary of Defense adopted a far more favorable stance towards gunship growth, due to part of the influence of the Presidential Science Advisory Committee, Dr. Lee Dubridge. That's interesting. The committee chief and science advisor to President Nixon, okay? And in the end is what they recommended to the Secretary of the Air Force is that, you know, approve a limited number of AC-130s. We're going to be modified, but not right now. We're going to do it later on into it. And essentially what they started to do is they started taking AC-130s that had already been delivered and started upgrading them to them. There wasn't a brand new gunship built until we got to the U version that was in the 90s, okay? Anyway, so, but, you know, I'll point home is that once again, Secretary of Defense in a weekly report was getting all this glowing response about what was happening in South Vietnam, and Brad Parkinson's name was stuck to it. My God, this was just golden. Great. Okay, next chart, please. Okay, so what do you do after you've flown 26 combat missions, 2 as commissioned commander, and you come back to the United States Air Force, and by this time he had pinned on lieutenant colonel, all right? And, oh, what's my job? And so what they said is that, yeah, we got this thing called SAMHSA or SMC. It's now out in El Segundo. We're going to send you out there. Well, what's my job there? He says, oh, by the way, I'm going to be, you're going to be working on ABRAS. You're going to be studying reentry vehicles and the signatures. And he started digging into this one, and it was great. And after a while, he got a telephone call, come up to the big office. General Schultz called him in, and he said, hey, Brad, I got a new job for you. We got this problem in the Pentagon where there's these 3 systems, or actually 4 systems that are being fought over. And we need you to go off and do an independent review of the system and come back and tell us, you know, what you think about it, okay? And so as you see in this quote here, I initially spent perhaps 3 or 4 months digging deeply into the 3 existing concepts, the advantages, the disadvantage, why it was getting enormous pressure from the Air Force, and in particular from the Aerospace Corporation contingent to support the Air Force's version of 621B as the tried and true method. Okay, you know, what this essentially was is that here's this lieutenant colonel being called into the president of the Aerospace, who has a personal stake in this, and telling him, Brad, you got to go and push 621B. 621B is the answer. And he's going, but, there's no buts, Brad. 621B is the answer. That's what Yvonne told him. Okay, next slide. Okay. Before we get to we're getting into the really good stuff right now. I says, so what had happened by this time is that 1972 had come and gone. 1973, January of 73, Nixon was sworn in for a 2nd term in the White House. And you got to understand is that Nixon came from Orange County. Orange County Republicans who funded his campaign pushed him towards the White House, and they said, payback time. Dick, and he says, well, what do you want? And he says, got Malcolm Currie, all right? He's manager and vice president of Hughes Aircraft, okay? Really smart guy. You need to give him a job. And he says, okay, what's the job? Well, he says, why don't you make him number 3 at the Pentagon, you know, in charge of all procurements and scientific inventions and stuff like that. And it's just like, well, you know, that's pretty good, okay? You know, so they call up Malcolm, and they said, hey, Malcolm, we want you to take this job. It wasn't really asked. It was, they were told them, the Republican Committee of Orange County told them, you're going to take this job, okay? We worked long and hard. Beckman Instruments, who he was then president or vice president for, had worked long and hard and given lots of money to the Republican Party. And they said, go to Washington, D.C. One problem. Malcolm's wife really didn't like Washington, D.C. And so when he got there, he walked around for a while, bought a home, moved in. Everything was going good. Decided that he needed to go back home. All right. So he started inventing trips to go to California. Oh, let me go to, let's go up to San Francisco. Let's go, he's essentially what Currie was doing was visiting every military installation up and down the coast. All right. And so in the process is that he ended up at Space and Missile Center, and he walked in and he says, oh, give me a status briefing on something. And they said, sir, you've already gone through all your status briefings. We've told you about every other program that we've had. And then he says, really? You don't have anything else? And General Schultz thought for a minute, and he says, well, we're working on this satellite navigation program thing, and I got this Lieutenant Colonel Brad Parkinson. Why don't I send you into him, and you can start listening to it, okay? And what happened is that Brad and Malcolm Currie sat in a room with just a table between him, and Brad started flipping through his charts. Malcolm was so smart that he was catching the errors in Brad's charts, and they were correcting it. And Brad says is that then he'd challenge Malcolm on it, and they'd both pull out a piece of paper and a slide rule, and they would work on the answers and say, see, it's this number. Well, how do you get that number? So, well, I can do this, divide this, multiply by that. And, oh, yeah, okay, that's right, okay. And the two of them were sitting there, and they were refining the 621B. And it became, Brad had him eaten out of his hand. Those two guys, every time Malcolm came back, he'd asked to have Brad put on his schedule for a briefing. Every time he rolled through, guess what? He's sitting there talking to the Secretary of Defense once again. All right, right into the ear of that. All right, next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to roll forward to August 1973. It is called Black Thursday in GPS lore. All right. Up until now, as I told you, there were 3 contested systems inside of there. All right. By this time, Time Nation had kind of fallen away to the down there. Okay. And so the System Acquisition Review Council was scheduled for August of '73, and this had turned into one of the very first 2 critical meetings that happened in GPS. One would think that with an Air Force general being told that the Air Force responsible for developing a single concept with the support of Dr. Currie and whatever Brad Parkinson presented would be accepted, okay? And so what happened is that Brad gets through, he's got a stack of 80 slides, he says. He walks inside of the Pentagon. He got through five slides, and the wolves came out. What the hell are you telling us? 621B is the answer? No, we told you to go and combine all the best of the best and give us one unified position. Why are you sitting there? Why, Lieutenant Colonel, are you following what Aerospace wants you to do? And Brad was caught red-handed. He was sitting there going dumbfounded. He put his trust in the Von Getting. He thought the concept, he thought with Malcolm Currie, and they said the whole room just erupted against him, and he thought he was toast, okay? And he thought, man, did I step on a landmine here? So, my God, what am I going to do? Next slide. Okay, now we're talking the Labor Day 1973 event. In the annals of GPS history, this is the day, Labor Day 1973, is the day that GPS was born. Let's review. Brad was technically smart, understood everything, knew it all. He had spent the first 4 months of his job studying and figuring out what was wrong with the other systems, and turned around and briefed it to Malcolm Currie, who concurred with all of his assessments. Okay? Not a problem in here. Brad also was stung by the political realities of the Gunship program. Here he was building this wonderful Gunship program. Isn't it wonderful? And it does all of these of the Department of Defense. Okay, so what he did is that he called together all the major players. He called in the Army, he called in the Navy, they called in NRL, called in the Army, all these support personnel, and they all ended up in a conference room in 1973 in the Pentagon, and it was a hot, bloody day. They had no air conditioning on in the conference room. It was just getting hotter and hotter inside of the room. And so what he did is that he sat in front of them and he said, listen, guys, by the time we leave this room, we've got to come up with a system. And so he turned over to the Navy and he says, timation. He says, NRL guys. He says, your single side tone ranging is stupid. Really got to go code division, multiple access. Everybody around the table started nodding their head. Yeah, that's it. Okay, yeah. And then he says, but listen, I really think that atomic clock idea of yours is pretty good. So I'm going to stick an atomic clock inside of it. And all of a sudden, Roger Easton's sitting here going like, okay, atomic clocks. It's not too bad. And then he went over to the big baby guys and he says, hey guys, your low Earth orbiting satellites only gives you 2D geolocation. Not really good. You guys really need 3D location for that. And they kind of all sheepishly looked and they said, yeah, okay, yeah, we agree that 3D location instantaneous with precise time would be great. And he says, great. And he says, fine. He says, and we're going to put them at Geo. And the Navy guys looked at him and said, no, you are not. And he says, that's 621B. I'm not going to go and sign up to a system that's 621B. And then Brad, remember what he taught at the academy, orbits, okay, sat there and says, okay, I'm going to make it at half Geo. I'm going to make 12-hour orbits. And he started calculating out how many satellites he needed in the orbits that he did. And he came up with the original concept of 18 satellites, 3 planes. And they sat there and they showed the math around there. And everybody in the room said, well, that's a couple more than what the 621B is, but we can live with that. And so the Navy was bought off. Okay, now he's got to get the Army in line and that. So he turns around to the Army and he says, okay, guys, your idea, not very good. And he says, yeah, but what are you going to do for us? And Brad says, I'll tell you what I'm going to do for you. It says, you guys have set up and proven SECOR, and you use the Yuma proving grounds. How about if we come down to Yuma, and you guys are in charge of all GPS testing for here until through the development program ends? And they all sat around there and looked at it and says, okay, so we can go back and tell the bosses that we're going to get a lot more money and we're going to be part of this new navigation program. And Brad says, yep. And that, so, you know, it says, so he had them, and he had them all sign on the line. And you're talking about, guys, in real time, charts are being made to construct the system. Analysis, decisions is being generated in that conference room. It was a marvelous time to be there. I mean, you could only imagine, and they were just plowing into it, okay? Now, Brad was really proud, and he thought he'd saved his career. And the first thing he did is he went back and he showed Dr. Getting, you know, what he had created. And Dr. Getting says, what the hell did you do? You just gave away the program. And Dr. Getting just like, get out of here, Parkinson. This is it. All right, next slide. All right, so he had his first big no from him. Okay. So now that he had the concept down, the next thing he had to do is exactly how we are going to do it, okay? And as Brad stated in this one, is that he came up with a few ideas. Is that they said, what, you're going to, you know, take our ideas and run? And it says, Brad says, oh, no. I'm going to build the first joint program office in DOD history. Up until then, they were, you know, SPOs, okay? So no, this is going to be a JPO, Joint Program Office, and we're going to have the Navy as the deputy commander of the office, and the Army is going to be represented here, okay? And we're going to bring in the Coast Guard, and we're going to have all these people, and so he laid down the foundations for it. And when he started pushing this around, but was a lot of very smart people started showing up with PhDs. So Brad had to figure out, well, what are you going to do with a bunch of PhDs that are coming in here? And he says, well, you know what? We're so smart here. We're going to go and do all the system engineering ourselves. Yeah, That's a great idea. And then we're going to go and contract out for the different pieces. And that's where user segment was defined. That's where space segment was defined. That's where control segment was defined. Okay. And so they said, and we are going to tie it all together. The JPO has the responsibility of doing that. Okay. And it was all uniform service members were sitting there doing this stuff. Next slide, please. So the problem he had is that he had to send it up the flagpole. All right. So after he figured all of the organization out and where his billets are and all of that stuff, he had to go up and see the big guy. Okay. So he went up to see General Schultz and walked in there. And I think you can only imagine that Yvonne had already called Schultz and told him that he thought it was stupid what Brad was doing. And so he walked in there and he said, oh yeah, say, we're going to do all the system engineering, and then we're going to go and get these people to build the parts. And that's where he almost lost his job. At that point, you know, he couldn't exactly grasp how he was doing it. Inside, if you keep reading in there, you're going to find out is that Schultz says, well, how the hell are you going to control all of this? Brad, you just what? You're going to let the contractors walk all over it? And he says, no. He says, we're going to have interface control documents between the major segments. And so Brad's promised to show it to me one of these days, but he says he had the picture. It was in a backup chart. That was the initial one that was showing the user segment, the space segment, and he had a bubble in there, and he said, you know, US to SS ICD, CS to SS ICD, okay? And he had them in there, okay? And so he showed General Schultz that, and he laid it down, and he says, so you guys are going to be writing these specifications, and then they're going to take those specifications, the ICDs, and turn it into design documents, and that's what they're going to build. And then he's going to verify that everything works the way they're supposed to, and he says, yes, sir. And he says, hey, at that point, the last two lines is that General Schultz sat back in his chair and smiled and nodded his head, and that was the go-ahead for us to begin the contract for the GPS in a relatively unusual way. That is why the GPS program is so different than any other Air Force program. You know, Brad really pulled on his experience from Gunship, where he put a whole bunch of smart people into the room and he started banging on them and they started moving mountains. And he figured, I did it once, I can do it again. And this time, Brad was politically savvy of what was going on. So he was even more dangerous than he was before. Okay, next slide. Okay, December 22nd, 1973, Block 1 effort was us, develop 4 satellites, procure 4 launch vehicles, develop a control segment, develop 3 types of user equipment, and an extensive test program. Check, 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 check. Okay? With this, though, you would think that Brad had it easy. He had a lot of opposition against GPS throughout the Air Force. Okay? Once again, these guys are sitting there looking at Brad, boy wonder, coming up with this great idea once again and stealing money from everybody's program. Where are they going to get to pay for this? Okay. He needed to quickly dissipate the opposition, so he created the inverted range because they couldn't wait until they had satellites in the sky to test it. So he says, what could we do? And then the guys at Magnavot says, you know, if we put a GPS transmitter on the ground and put the receivers in the airplane and we fly everything over the one transmitting on the ground, and then we can go and determine range, rate, and accuracies. Do it. Okay, so they went off there and they started in a gangbusters. Within a couple of months, they were out there at Yuma flying around, and the Army was saying, oh, thank you, welcome to our place. Come here, this is your area that you will have here, okay? And so he got that up and going. And says, the next thing he hit to is that he went back to the NAVSEC, and he says, oh, by the way, guys, I need you to launch NTS-2, okay? NTS-2 carried the first Block 1 payload, and also the NRL was still fighting at that time for its STTR, their timation. So they said, oh, by the way, make room inside of there for my payload too. So they put 2 payloads, they took it up to Vandenberg, they took an Atlas booster, modified it like they were going to do for the production, the demonstration test program, went off and tested it, okay? And so as they began to launch NavStars, the competing systems began to fade away. Brad tells with great glee is that, well, first of all, let's talk about the NRL. The NRL realized by the time when they got on orbit, they saw the performance numbers of the Navstar payload, GPS payload was way better than their STTR. And they were getting better accuracy. It was easy, smooth to use. And then they said, that's it. Roger threw in the towel. He says, we're giving them clocks. It's the best we can hope for, okay? And so what really said is, by that time, too, the Army had gotten out of SECOR. And they said, if this GPS thing works, we want it instead of the SECOR system. So they were going to sunset the SECOR system now. And so the only guys left fighting them were the transit people in the Navy. And so Brad says, with glee, he went into a meeting, him and the transit team. He went in there, and at the end of the meeting, he stole $60 million in 1974 funding, 75 funding from the Navy, and they built an additional 6 satellites for the GPS Block 1 program to test out. Okay, biggest win in that. And at that time, you could see that the writing was on the wall for transit. They were done. Okay, they realized the test results were coming in. They were good on good. Okay, and this GPS was spectacular. Next slide, please. Okay, let's roll into it. So Brad's out there launching satellites, testing, everything's going good. Brad John in 57, 1977 rolled around. He was 30 years into the service. And he decided it was time to punch out. Okay. Also at that time, Dr. Currie was not asked to continue under the Carter administration, so we lost a good supporter there. Dr. Getting celebrated his 65th birthday that year and required by the policies he created to retire. Okay. And Parkinson had been with the program for 6 years, twice as long as anybody else, long expected to be a rising star. And they said, yeah, no, you're not going to get you a star, but we'll bring you over as a colonel and send you to the Pentagon. And so Brad was into the office of the Secretary of Defense. And Brad kind of looked at that and said, nah, I don't want that job. I'm going to go off and do something else, okay? And so he left, okay? So in a very critical year prior to the launch of the first Block 1 satellite, everybody who was a supporter in GPS left. Next slide. Whew. Okay, so pretty soon after this, the JPO concept and the realization that anybody could use this thing was really grinding on Air Force. All right, they were sitting there going, wait a minute, we're paying for this system and the Navy and the Army are doing what? It says, well, they're going to buy some user equipment, but you guys have to put the space segment up. You have to get the launch vehicles. You have to go and get the control segment up and running. And they sat there and says, hey, you know, why do we have to do this? You're cutting the amount of money we have in our budget for this, okay? And the early times were also echoed, this view was also echoed, if you read Scott Pace's book, is that because GPS is a support system and not a standard weapon system with a clear mission and history of well-defined operational concepts, early understandings of the value of the system were less straightforward with the tanks and the aircrafts and everybody else. This increased the need to sell the program, particularly to potential users. The JPO addressed this problem, especially during the phase 1 by emphasizing one of the more tangible capabilities of the joint program also increased the need to sell it to other people in the military to get them to buy it, okay? And that's why I'm sitting there going, is if you read that one, is that it is a support system and they couldn't see the value of GPS, how short-sighted. Today, we couldn't even think of living it on it, okay? And without the guiding hands of those 3 gentlemen I mentioned before, GPS was not on a very solid ground, okay? So they went off and they started launching the first satellite. The test results came in and it was good. Next slide, please. All right? And everything looked like, hey, it was beginning to show it, all right? All right? The problem was is that they still didn't have anybody willing to sign on the bottom line to authorize the operational system of GPS. Okay, and herein lies the story of nuclear detection. In 1978, the United States planned to become a signatory of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT. Okay, signing that treaty would require the United States to give up rights to test nuclear weapons and also the need and means to verify that other nations were not doing it. They were stuck in a hard spot, okay? Government wanted to do this, and they were trying to sit there and say, yeah, but how are we going to detect nuclear weapons? And that's what the VELA program came up. There was two components to it, VELA Soldier and VELA Hotel. Hotel was the satellite side, all right? So there's a guy, and his name escapes me right now, and I'll think of it, who was sitting there walking around SMC pushing the ability to put an NDS payload on anybody's satellite, and he heard that GPS was in deep doo-doo and nobody wanted it. And so he walked into the directorate's office at the time, or not directorate, the JPO's office, and says, hey, I got something that might help you. He says, do you got room on the satellite to put something that's about this big and it takes 25 watts? And you remember I told you that Brad sold them on the idea to get 6 additional satellites? Okay, well, they convinced the Secretary of Defense to go and put that nuclear detection payload on the last remaining 6 satellites. And they did that, and they started flying it and testing it. They found out that the accuracy exceeded their expectations, okay? And so with that, the ORD, the Operational Requirements Document for GPS, came down from Strategic Air Command. That's really strange. You look at it, a 4-star general in Strategic Air Command was the guy who was signing off on a navigation satellite. They really didn't care that this thing could help you navigate. All they wanted was the ability to locate nuclear weapons first in the air and atmosphere. And then that's what it is. And that was the moment that GPS transitioned from a development system into a operational system, which we know today. Okay, next one. Okay, well, you'd think after that success of the testing and the NUDET system being added and the signing of it, that there would be smooth sailing. No, it isn't. It's just like any litter. The smallest one always gets in trouble first. So shortly after they authorized it, the very first thing, the OSD decided to reduce the expenditures by 30%, $500 million. They said, no, you don't need that money. We need it for something else. I think it's something else to deal with that. They forced a restructure in which the satellite constellation was cut from 24 satellites to 18 satellites. Okay, so they're back to the Block 1 posture. There's a whole interesting story of how they got to 24 satellites. Okay, the Block 2 development satellite was dropped, and the design was scaled down in terms of weight and powers, nuclear hardness, and lasing. That was the future add-ons that they wanted to add to them. Okay. This reduction did not allow the system to achieve the two-dimensional capability requested by the government. When they signed off on the order, they thought in 1981 they would have 2D capability in the air. They didn't do that, okay? And the Air Force leadership in 1980 then went around and zeroed out the whole funding, okay? But the OSD at this time somehow had gone back in and stuck it back into place, okay? In 1982, the whole act was repeated again, okay? But in 1983, the budget battle subsided, and all the GPS Block 2 production monies were put into the budget. They told them to go off and start building it stuff. So if you go back into the annals of GPS, you'll see every major contract for the GPS operational Block 2 systems were signed in 1982. Okay, and away we went. All right, next slide. That's essentially my story, so let's go and do a little cleanup now. So this is not a story that's been finished yet, all right? You know, I always wondered who attended the Labor Day meeting, but if you go on the web, you can find there's lots of articles of who attended. Still haven't really talked to anybody other than Brad and Gaylord about what went on at that. I was able to get the Aerospace 57 report is considered classified, but the cover page has been released to public domain. Okay, and if somebody is so inclined to go onto the Institute of Navigation Southern California website and you look up Dr. Diamond's presentation, and inside of there you'll see a picture of it. Okay, Dr. Currie dropped off the face of the earth for a good 20 years. One of the things he did after leaving the Secretary of Defense office is that he went off and made the first electric bikes. They didn't do very well and got sued. And so he went away, but just about 3 years ago, he got inducted into the GPS Hall of Fame. Showed up meeting, had a wonderful talk about that. My latest thrust is that when COVID is done, I'm going to take the time to go up to Caltech. It's where Lee DeBridge's papers are being held, and I want to look up his notes from the day that Ivan Getting went in there and had the meeting. Okay, next slide. Don't know if I have it in here. We'll see which one is here.
I think that's the last slide.
Okay, so go back to the very first. Can you jump all the way back to the slide that says what you're going to learn, and we're going to review what we learned in here. Okay, so once again, let's review. So what did the Slovakian independence movement of 1918 do? It drove into Ivan Getting a sense of duty, and the ability to go and against odds is to advocate for something that you believe in strongly, okay? What did the development of radar do? It says, well, the development of radar put Lee DeBridge in the same office with Ivan as Nixon's scientific advisor. Ivan went to complain to Lee about what was going on, is that he told him and says, hey, blank check, go for it, okay? Nixon being elected to the second term in the White House. When he won, the Orange County Republicans needed to fill that spot. They picked Malcolm Currie. Malcolm Currie had the technical chops to run with the best of them. And so when Brad Parkinson and Malcolm got together, it was a match made in heaven, okay? Sputnik's influence showed us how 3D radio navigation or radio navigation with a space source could be done, all right? And it developed all the basic understandings of what we had to do. AC-130 gunship, it demonstrated to Brad what a motivated team under adverse conditions can accomplish, and also highlighted to him the political nature of everything that he was to do forward in his life, all right? And so what was the significance of the NDS payload? The NDS payload saved GPS. Without the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty requirement, there would be no GPS today. The Air Force would have let this thing just slide off into nothingness, okay? Who knows, the CD process was initially highly controlled by the Air Force, but if you look in the later years, control of the ICD and the system engineering has now really been put out to sea to contractors. Okay, is that good? Is that bad? All right, it's a whole different operating mode from when I started in 1984. Okay, now you heard my claim on GPS on Raytheon. I deny it. I do not think it's substantial, and I've entertained all the people. I've introduced you into the major cast of characters. A lot of these guys, a few of them are, Brad's around, Malcolm's around these days, and you can possibly send them the note. So with that, I'll take the questions. It looks like I got one here.
Hello, Frank. Great presentation again. A question for you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I know that. I didn't know that he was CEO of Hughes Aircraft from '88. Of the Delco Electronics, I'm not too sure about that. I'm going to have to research that, because in the legal troubles that followed him with his bike thing really torpedoed his career, and he kind of went underground. There are other negative comments that were made why he was coming back to California, which I won't on something that's going to be recorded, but there was a little discussion about why he was showing up in California so much, and it really tarnished his reputation at that time. So, but thank you for that, and I'm going to research that one. Is there any other questions?
Yes, Frank, can you hear me okay?
Sure.
Okay, yep. How did Raytheon even get labeled as the creator of GPS as the first part? Because my understanding was that Raytheon was only directly involved with GPS with the successor to augmenting GPS with the differential GPS, namely WASP, Wide Area Augmentation System, that's currently used for LPV and whatever approaches to compensate for selective availability. Then, of course, possibly LOS, Local Area Augmentation System, which is now GBAS, ground-based augmentation system. And then secondarily, I thought it was Rockwell International and Seal Beach that developed GPS. So I'm a little bit confused as to the relationship here between that and the government when it comes to Milstar or Navstar rather.
Okay, go find my chart, second step, MOSAIC. I'll answer your first one. Yeah. First step. Yeah. Next one. Next one. Go. Okay. Oh, no. The one there, I was going to read out to it. In fact, I just added it. Yeah, second step. Raytheon responded to the RFP, and in the second paragraph, and its proposal contained a method that did not require the exact location of the launch point be known, but would constantly derive it. This feature was called MOSAIC. Okay, the MOSAIC, go down 2 lines. MOSAIC missile would contain a receiver that would make use of time difference of arrival of 4 land-based transmitters and determine its location in 3 dimensions. It is that claim that they said, oh, Raytheon back in 1960 came up with the idea of 3D positioning from radio navigation signals. You see, we actually invented GPS. I mentioned that were they using pseudo-random codes? I can't find any verification of that, or was it some other means? Maybe they were, they probably were. Okay, but as I said, GPS is just not positioning, it is also timing, all right? And being able to be connected back into the national standards, okay? Because we're tied back to Paris. GPS clocks are tied back into Paris, okay? So it's exactly, everybody beats at the same frequency. And that's why, you know, Raytheon from time to time when I get into it is way back in 1960, they claimed they invented it. And I said, no, you didn't have if you had the clock mentioned in any of those write-ups, then yes, I would give you credence. But really, no, it was Brad Parkinson making the deal to include the clocks, and the clocks he knew because of his Loran experience. You know, if you went back in there and I pointed out to you that he got into Loran on top of the Gunship platform, realized how much better that position and timing could make your solution. That's why I said Brad just kind of brought that all together in his head with Malcolm Currie as they worked into it and they went into the meeting, they all laid it out, and they said, bam, that's the day the GPS was born. Okay? So that takes care.
What about with Rockwell International and Seal Beach? Because the claim is that they're the ones that actually developed GPS as part of the Navstar contract. And
Yes.
Tom Logson, who you was, I guess, your friend, when he presented it to us at AIAA's ASAT awards dinner, he stated that he was the one that actually developed the actual implementation of this, mathematically as the number of satellites required, the constellation required, and everything, implying that Rockwell National.
All right. So Tom Loxton was an orbits guy. Bob Kukulski was an orbits guy. They both worked together. All right. So Dick Schwartz, there's a whole interesting story, is that there was 2 parts to Rockwell. One was located in Seal Beach. The other one was up in Downey. And then there was also Palmdale. All right. And so if you got to understand in the pecking order of Rockwell, nobody liked Seal Beach. Those guys were
where the headquarters was.
Yes, well, then they disappeared, and that's where the B-1 was built. See, everybody inside of Rockwell until the early 80s was all about the B-1. That shuttle contract was really nice. It was producing $800 million a year into the bottom line and employed a lot of people out in Downey. But down in Seal Beach, all they ever did was built a second stage of rocket called the Saturn, the S2, okay? But you got to understand is that also inside of the Rockwell family were the guys out in Audinetics in Anaheim who had all the smarts of doing inertial navigation and doing navigation, all right? So what Tom is alluding to is that, did he create the GPS orbits? Brad kind of created it and handed it off to the guys, to all these. And there were 4 contenders for the satellites. You know, there was Rockwell, there was RCA, there was Hughes. Who was the 4th one? GE, I think, was involved in it at that time too. Okay, and so they were all went out there, and everybody had to prove what the Earths were, and they did that. So yes, Loxton was part of it. All right, but really, where the smarts it came down to, really where the point of where I'll say Rockwell shined in this area is that because the guys out in Anaheim were building the Minuteman guidance package, they knew how to operate in an intense radiation environment. When Brad picked the 12-hour orbit, he didn't realize that he was putting us right on the outer edge of a radiation belt. And so it took somebody, only GE and Rockwell had the know-how to go and build something to operate in a highly radioactive or highly energetic man-made environment. Okay, so they were really lucky. On top of that, because of the inertial navigation systems that were being put into the subs were being built out in the Anaheim, those guys knew, and the ICBM calculations to being able to launch and hit a target, those guys knew navigation. So Dick Schwartz sat there and started pulling together guys. Luxton was one of them. There were a lot of guys, Andy Kotick and all these other guys started showing up, that Bob Klukowski and, you know, on and on and on, Jack Radak, all these people who had expertise in their area. And when they all got them into the room, it was unfreaking believable. And what that relationship between Brad and Malcolm Currie was, is that Gaylord Green was smart. He's almost as smart as Brad. He came down there and started talking to Dick Schwartz, the program manager, and those two guys really hit it off. And they just understood exactly what was doing. And Gaylord, in his time, had spent time over in the ICBM world, so he understood that when he started talking to the Anaheim guys, you know, hey, these guys actually know what they're doing. They know all the problems in that. So that's why I'm sitting here going, is that the system, the core of the system engineering of the constellation, getting it to work together, yes, that goes into the Rockwell column. What is most important about what Rockwell contributed is when they figured out that adversaries could GPS against us, and they had to develop the selective availability and anti-spoofing techniques. That is an invention done by 2 people out in our Anaheim division, Chuck Mosley and Francis Nakamoto. Those 2 guys came up with how to do SA and AS, and they created it, and they went in there and they sold it to the government, and they all went around and said, yeah, that'll do it, didn't it? And that. But unfortunately, they turned all that stuff off. So Rockwell was heavily involved into it, and I was sitting there as a young engineer watching all this going on and sitting there going, oh, is this how big aerospace companies work? Well, this is kind of neat, man. You know, I kind of like this. So, yeah, this is it.
Was the Anaheim location the one where that currently occupies, one of the buildings occupied by Fry's Electronics, that Anaheim?
Well, not that building. It's the complex that's north to it. If you go down La Palma Road, you'll see this tower, and that was building 202. And that's where GPS engineering was located, and all the labs on the 3rd floor is where the on the 2nd floor were developed, where the hardware was developed. But yeah, it was that guys over in building 202 that did it.
It was across the street from where the current Fry's is.
Yep, across the street. You'd have to go to the I forgot the name of the sub shop, but just come straight out of the sub shop and walk straight across the street. You know, there's a monument out there. Say again?
Tommy Stuffers?
Yeah. You just walk straight across and you'll be there. Because when we used to go out to Anaheim, it was just like, where am I going to get lunch? I know. Straight across Tommy Stuffers back, and boom, go into another set of meetings in the afternoon. And all the production of hardware done in building 203, the one behind that building. And I lived a good 6 years of my life, you know, going to there every morning and getting hardware out the door and testing it on the factory floor and launching it and then watching over it. And like I told you guys, it's my job. I was named program manager for the on-orbit support for all my years of service on GPS. And at the time, the job didn't mean anything, and everything changed. If anyone was on before, they heard the stories that on January 1st, 2004, at about 8 o'clock in the morning, my house phone rings, and I got hold for General so-and-so, and I'm going like, what? And then this guy gets on and says, you Frank Czopek? And I go, yeah. Oh, damn it, what's happening to my satellite? Blah, 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 blah. GPS 23, it took in a dump over Germany and was causing problems. And all of a sudden I realized is that we stopped every, that was the first time I realized is that a failure on GPS can stop actions in place. Okay, and you know, once GPS became unreliable, nothing was going into the air in the Gulf, and we were still shooting things down there. And he was just livid that this satellite had failed. Now, Block 2Rs were being built by Lockheed Martin at that time, should have been in the air, and my satellite had already exceeded its design life. It had failed on 2 clocks, and that was the third one, and we had warned them about it, but that didn't matter. I was just getting an earful, and I said, yes, sir, let me check into the situation, and we'll get back to you. So
Couple of follow-up.
I called them back and told them the story. And sure.
Couple of follow-up questions. One, you mentioned that when one of them went to the Pentagon, that one of them would do the corrections and the calculations on the fly. I missed who was who in that whole thing, and how, and the other one wanted the other guy to be in all future meetings. That was a little bit confusing. If you please re-explain that. And secondly, if Rockwell was really the prime contractor for Navstar, how did Raytheon end up with getting the contract for the differential GPS for WAS?
Okay, you know, when GPS became well, you got to go back. We got to go to the calculations on the fly is on the gunship chart, the first one. Okay, you got to understand is that when you awarded $1 billion contract for satellites, that got the attention of a lot of contractors. And so everybody started coming to feed at the GPS trough. You know, there was a time that when I showed up in '84, we didn't get the best second lieutenants in the world. But boy, I'll tell you, right after Gulf War I, GPS was the #1 requested slot for incoming second lieutenants. And these kids were scary smart. Okay. And as the after effect of that Gulf War I, everybody was trying to figure out what they could do with GPS. And a few enterprising companies, Raytheon being one of them, said, hey, what about this concept? And they went off and did the system studies, and they sold the idea, and they found support. Okay, and they got a line item in somebody's budget, and they started producing it. Okay, Raytheon really, moment of fame came not in those days when they took over the whole OCX contract. But then again, you have to be very careful what you wish for. That OCX contract has turned into, you know, a set of stones around their neck, and it's holding them down. And you know, my luck to do what it was to be done. Okay, go back to this chart here. Go up to the one where it says on the bottom one there, and I can't really see it, but you can see that EW warfare receiver was implemented. And so when having a conversation with Brad about that, he said you had to go and set up and solve equations while flying to input the proper values so the system would behave the way it is. And that's where I said Brad Parkinson was teaching guys how to go and do some test firing, look at the corrections, you know, figure out where the guns were pointing, what was happening, and then go in there and reset and the gains on all of the loops, and then go off and do it. And he said, oh, it wasn't a hard job. It was only a 4x4 matrix, so then you had to solve. And then you took the two numbers and then you typed them in, and then everything was fine. And I'm going like, yeah, for if you got a PhD and you know what you're doing, and I hope you got it all right. Yeah, this is it. So that's where inputting stuff on the fly came from. That when later generations of Gunship, they automated everything and didn't use that anymore. But it was impressive in the early days that they were tweaking the system going into the combat theater as they flew in.
I was actually referring to the Pentagon meetings. You're mentioning that one of them was able to make all the corrections.
Oh, no. Okay, that's in the Labor Day. Remember, they were creating the system as they went. And so they were taking the 620 charts. Next one. Next chart. Okay, it is in this meeting where Brad was lining out and telling everybody, back one, he was sitting there and telling everybody what they were going to get out of it. And they had to accept it if they wanted to continue in. And this is where they started taking the 621B chart package that he presented in August, and they started marking it up and putting in numbers onto it. So they were creating the schedule, the system description, the estimated performance response, you know, all those top level numbers that you do. And then he had everybody in the room, and they were all just, you know, calculators were in vogue at the time. So they were running numbers and checking each other's math, and then going and putting it down and marking it up. And I don't know if they were hanging the pictures up in the, on a wall or anything, but a later story, which has not been confirmed, is that somehow it went from, because it was too hot in the Pentagon, they went back to the hotel room, and oh God, what's his name? Major Birnbaum was requested to get the refreshments for the night. And so he made a run, and they ended up filling up the bathtub full of ice and putting beer and other liquor assortments into it. And everybody had stripped down to their white T-shirts and their boxer shorts. They had a lieutenant in the center of the room pounding on a keyboard as they walked around talking and telling him what to type. And that's how they built the tech package that Brad went in to go take to General Schultz the following week. And I'm going like, that's a story that I really want to get confirmation on. I want to know who the lieutenant was who was sitting on the middle of the floor as they had all these other guys sitting around there telling him what to do and how to type this stuff on the chart. And they had the glue sticks out. They were cutting and pasting pictures into it, just like the good old days when you had to break briefing charts from other materials. So it was quite an event. That whole Labor Day event, this was a real grinder of activity. We got some more questions. What do we got here?
This is a follow-up question before I hand out to somebody else, though. Regarding, would it be correct to say that Raytheon would not, the whole reason that WAS and differential GPS was created was a way to get around selective availability, and therefore, if Rockwell had not created selective availability, there would be no Raytheon further involvement or WAS or differential GPS. Would that be a correct statement?
No. Okay, so let's go talk about it. Is that so? First of all, let's make the statement is that Ed Martin from Rockwell International sat down there and he typed up his concerns. He'd seen the test reports. He'd seen the bombing runs. He understood how the vehicle testing was going, and he was very concerned about what an adversary could do in a primitive way to use GPS against us, all right? And so he typed up a letter of concern. He went to the directorate. Once again, it was Major Birnbaum, who is going to be the guy leading the ICDs, all the production, the 200 series of ICDs. He showed him the letter, and he said, Birnbaum just stared at the paper for about 15 minutes and didn't say a thing. And then he said, Ed says, is that he reached into his drawer, he pulled out a stamp that said secret on it, and he stamped it, and he says, don't tell anybody what you just did. I want to go and run this around the shop and see what they think, okay? And they didn't hear anything, okay? Month or two goes by, and they get a call saying like, hey guys, we'd like you to do a denial of accuracy study. Denial of accuracy? Yeah. We need you to do a denial of accuracy. How are you going to prevent GPS from being used against us? And so they created the DOA report. And in fact, that was the name of ICD 203, DOA, denial of accuracy. Everybody thought it was a stupid name, so they came up with selective availability anti-spoofing They thought that was a better title for all of this stuff. But that's where it came out of it, and that's where, when you really want to say what did Anaheim contribute, it was those guys coming up with AS and SA and saying, hey, this is the way we can do it. All right. Now, WAS, on the other hand, was created when the FAA was being told that all the other navigation systems that they ever used on all the airplanes were being shut down. They shut down Omega. They were sitting there going to sunset Loran. TACAN was being shut down. And they said, if you want to go and navigate inside of airplanes without maps and compasses, you better go and use GPS. And they came back and said, well, what about the accuracy? What is the reliability? What is the outages? And, you know, and all of this stuff. So they went off and they chased another big study, which Raytheon was involved in determining the performance values and the performance metrics that they could guarantee in the service. Okay, and it was from that WAS and GBAS is that they then allowed the FAA to quote declare GPS a primary navigation standard, and that's what's being you know. But the problem is that all aircraft have to be equipped with WAS receivers, and I guess that's another good thing out of COVID is that they're going to be retiring all these old aircraft, so a lot of WAS receivers are going to start getting placed into service. All right, but that wasn't, you know. That was the next thing. So Raytheon probably would have still gotten into the game because, like I said, when you start throwing billion-dollar contracts around, every contractor is going to start looking at how do I get a piece of that.
Was TACAN ever?
Okay, next question.
Just to follow up with what you just said right now, was TACAN ever for civilian use other than DME? Because my understanding is TACAN is still being used by the military. So why would the FAA ever pull out of it? Is it even theirs to pull out of other than the DME portion of it?
You know, if you look at it and you discuss it with the certification of WAS and everything that's going forward, they're going to start moving forward with sunsetting all of these services. Okay? And they're going to rely on GPS as the primary navigation standard. That's why right now it's a hot topic with everybody. That's why the adjacent band compatibility and everything, nobody's got the money to keep funding all these other systems when GPS does everything you want so much better. It just has some annoying glitches that we can fix if you care to put some money into it. But, you know, they want to reinvent the wheel, and I'm just like, nah, you don't have to do that, guys.
So the military is actually going to sunset TACAN, tactical navigation, as well?
They don't want to pay for it anymore. They want to know when can we get that out of that line item out of our budget. Okay, they're tired. The Air Force is tired of paying the GPS bill for everybody to use, and they're getting nothing out of it.
Okay, I think there's another question from Jim. Did you see it? Frank, did you see it?
Let's see.
Also one from Dog, another one from Dog, and from an anonymous attendee.
Yeah, well, anonymous guy, you're going to have to wait until I pull that story together. That's brewing in my head. Did JPL play a role in the creation of GPS? No, absolutely not. Okay, has JPL saved GPS? Yes, they have. Okay, Yoaz Bar server, they should, you know, go thank him the next time. And Dr. Young, those two guys are my heroes. Okay, Dr. Young, I got in the early 2000 time frame, I was asked to provide a GPS antenna to measure the phase variations of the, well, okay, what was happening is that when you range to a GPS receiver is ranging to a source, if you turn the receiver 180 degrees, is that you can see a 2 or 3 nanosecond shift, which relates to an error source of, let's say, 0.4 of a meter or something like that. I forgot the exact math, okay? And what you find out is that the antenna, the receiving antenna on a GPS receiver is not perfect. And if it isn't uniformed all the way around, the gain varies and the phase center varies. All right, so the guys over at NOAA, NGS out in Silver Springs, Maryland, came up with a way to map receiver antennas. And so when you're really doing high precision land surveying, you go off and you calibrate your antenna and then you bring it back, and then you apply the correction factors. Well, after a while, people in Silver Spring said, hey, what about the satellite? Doesn't it have variations? And we sat there and said, found out that the very first DR, discrepancy report against the GPS satellite Block 2 on orbit, was that they said, do you guys realize that this is 8.76 inches closer to the Earth than what you told us? And we said, get out of here. No. And they went for years studying this, okay? And the guys in Silver Springs realized that it was a face center shift off of the satellite. Now, we had Dr. Love who did calculations, and there's a story I can tell you about Dr. Love, but he showed us that the phase center was actually at the base of the transmitting antenna, exactly where you thought it was going to be. And so we measured from the center of gravity of the spacecraft up to the base and gave that number to the GPS operations group, and they put it inside of it. And I said, nope, it's closer, it's closer. And so what Jerry did is that, do you have a GPS antenna? I said, yes, I do have a spacecraft antenna. He said, great, I want to measure it. And I said, okay, bring it out there. And if you go into GPS World, there is a whole story on it. And he went out there and he looked it up and he started measuring. Guess what his number found out to be? He showed me, he proved to the world that the Block 2 GPS antennas had a phase offset. The phase center was offset 8.76 inches off the bulkhead. Okay? And it was just like, huh? Dr. Love was wrong, okay? And it was Dr. Young at JPL who made the calculations and showed us that, yeah, this is what's probably happening on your antenna farm, but don't worry, I can take that same measurement technique that they used on the ground and apply it to things in space. And so if you go there, JPL now has a correction table of all the phase offsets of all the GPS satellites flying. Okay, and so that's Dr. Young. That's one thing he's done. JPL's other greatest contribution is when they came up and created Gypsy. Now I think it's called RTX. Is that Yoaz was able to prove to me that within 4 seconds of a satellite going in out-of-bound condition, he could send a page to my telephone, okay, notifying me of this. And it is well beyond the capability of the control segment that was built back then, the original IBM built one. Right now, AEP is a little better on the response time, and hopefully OCX is going to be right up there with JPL. And if not, my plug for you is to go and use JPL service if you want to know exactly what's happening on the satellite at any given time. If you're really that worried about what's happening on it, JPL's got it nailed. Okay, what's the other question here that I got to answer? Can rogue nations hijack GPS for their own purpose? Stay tuned. If you'll notice that they're putting a challenge of hackathon now. Space Force is going to go look satellite hackathon. And so they have not revealed what satellite it is, but they are now challenging hackers to see if they can get inside of and control the satellite. I'm pretty confident that the current crypto systems that we are employing to protect our uplinks and downlinks will withstand an attack, and they will just shrug them off. It is not to show the case that it can be done. One of the interesting stories out of the early days of GPS is that we built the very first miniature sigless receiver, went down to Motorola, paid for it, did all the development of it. And they asked us, what channel do you want to use? And we said channel 6. Okay, just pick the chip. We didn't want 1, we didn't want 2, we just picked the number. Glenn Moore, he just picked the number and said, make it channel 6. And you find out that every time you built a receiver, sigless transceiver from Motorola, it would always start off life as signal 6, and then you'd have to pay to change it to another one. And what we came out of it is that we found out somebody didn't pay to make the change, and they put that system on their satellite, and it just so happens a GPS satellite would cross over into its uplink beam of the other satellite, and it would start saying, what the hell are you doing? Shut up, I don't understand you. And then you would have 2 satellites broadcasting in the same GPS frequencies, in the sigless frequencies. And they were complaining to us that, what is wrong with your satellite? What is it? It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It gets illuminated by a proper tone at the proper frequency, and boom, it takes off and doing it. What the heck are you guys being so cheap that you didn't change it? And so then they had to start calculating out when conjunctions of GPS satellites with their satellites, and they complain to this day about this. And I'm going, not our problem, guys. You screwed up, okay? So we'll see on that hacking issue. What else we got here? Can you explain the timing concept of GPS? It's just the timing facilitates the position, info, data. Thank you. What do you mean the timing concepts? Do you guys realize is that right now, it was a really interesting infographic, if I could bring it up, but you got to, the question is that when the NRL convinced us to put an atomic clock on board the satellite, we went from 10 parts in 10 to the 10th accuracy down to 10 parts in 10 to the 13th originally, or 10 parts in 10 to the 12th, 2 orders of magnitude better than a crystal. All right. Right now we are running at 10 parts in 10 to the 15th on good days, and that's low parts in 10 to the. It's astounding. So when they put that type of accuracy onto the system, into it, is that what they also made the decision is that they would slave GPS to UTC. GLONASS doesn't do that. All right. That's why their time system is on Moscow time. That's why nobody likes using a GLONASS system. But though they have bitten the bullet and are trying to sync their satellites to UTC. Having some problems with it. Galileo, same thing. Very interesting thing out of this is that the clocks that they chose, they went cheap on their clocks. Those clocks are maybe doing 10 parts in 10 to the 11th, 10 parts in 10 to the 12th on a good day. GPS is doing 10 parts 14, 10 parts 15 every day. And that's so when anybody wants to do time transfer, you start using GPS. Okay, so what's the big deal about time transfer? Time transfer is key to the financial institutions. Wall Street is GPS satellites. When you hit and punch your button to sell or buy, it's going up to a GPS satellite, which is referenced to UTC, and giving you the most accurate timestamp possible. All right, and that's why I'm just sitting there going like, hey, that's pretty neat. When you get into comm systems, GPS timing allows you not to worry about where your frame boundaries or your edges are. Oh, you just lock in GPS, derive the time, calculate where the frame boundary, boom, you're up and running in that. It makes life so much easier, all right? And that's why the timing system is really taken off. And if you look at it, nobody talks about GPS in the government anymore. They talk about position, navigation, and timing, PNT. And each of those are very important. And they're trying to get away from the monkey of GPS. Any more questions out there?
The U.S. Naval Observatory master atomic clock still in the play? Because I thought that was the official timekeeper. So they're now using GPS instead of that?
No. NIST and USNO are tasked, are the primary standards for the United States. For USNO is a primary standard for the United States, NIST is on the side, okay? But all those people run back to Paris to keep it all in lock, all right? Fred Walsh, the guy that runs the USNO, and it's building 58 or 52 on the campus where they keep the master time clocks. His job is to make sure is that the GPS time sync is good to UTC. That's his job. Is that he's got to make sure that that all locks up and it's all tight. Okay, let's see. How many of the original GPS satellites are still in orbit today? All of them. All of them are up there. Problem is that some of them have been disposed of. And when they say disposed of, is that they mean they take them up to about 200 kilometers higher than the operational orbit, spin them up to about 25 RPM, and point them away from the sun so they'll never turn on. So there are these some 70 some, I don't know, let's see, there's 31 operational, and they've launched, I think they're into the 80s right now, so they're like, I don't know, 45 or 50 dead hulks floating around. Plus, gathering or just taking up space there. And what is the history book for GPS? That is very, very interesting question. There is no history. If you go to the Institute of Navigation and search GPS history, you will find bits and pieces. Probably one of the best early articles, which I wrote this paper in concept before Brad wrote his GPS World Heroes, which kind of picks up on the early days of GPS and moves it forward. But he said I got everything right. I would go into GPS World and look at that. And then, like I said, the Apollo connection, it isn't an Apollo to GPS. It's just like I realized that GPS 12's lightning strike, or not GPS 12, Apollo 12's lightning strike had a huge prime the crew for Apollo 13's accident. And if they didn't have that lightning strike, we would have been in a lot worse shape on Apollo 13. It would have not been as smooth as it was. And I can show you all sorts of history on that one at some point. So those are my questions in that. I really thank you for letting me to come in and talk to you guys. Besides that, we've had so many people hang on. 25 of them are there now. Okay, great. We're up to 31, so thank you. If you got any questions, please send me your comment. I'll be happy to. And I'm also going to send an updated, these charts don't read very cleanly, so I realize that there's a couple of mistakes I need to fix. So please don't put these charts on it. I'll send you an updated package in a day or so.
Okay, will do. Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. Yeah, so this is scheduled for your Apollo talk. Listen.
Thank you for the fall right now. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Something in the fall time. So yeah, we'll be
okay.
There.
Anytime you like, we'll arrange.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Right.
It's so exciting.
You guys have a wonderful afternoon. Talk to you later.
Talk to you later. Thank you, Frank. Yeah, thank you, everyone. This concludes today's e-town hall meeting for AIAA Las Vegas section. Once again, please look into our e-membership information, and if you would like to volunteer for writing articles for this event or other, please contact us. So once again, thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye.